I've been getting a lot of questions recently about what's the best way to work with a guitar DI track so that it sounds big and powerful. And so I made this video today to give us a really big, broad overview of what guitar DIs are and how to best process them so that we can get the best guitar tone possible. This video is going to give you that foundation of knowledge to help you make the best decisions possible for your song. So if you ever wanted to know if there's benefit to pre-processing your guitar DIs or your bass DIs before you reamp them, we're going to get into all those details. And just so you know, there's a massive difference in the tone that we can get depending on the order of processing. So be sure to watch it all the way to the end because you don't want to miss a single thing. Hey, hope you're having a great day today. My name is Bobby Balo, and I'm the mixing and mastering engineer at Raytown Productions. And this channel is dedicated to helping you make better sounding music without needing to buy expensive gear or unnecessary plugins. If you're new here, thank you so much for joining me today. Be sure to hit that subscribe button because I drop new videos every single week, and you do not want to miss those because they're going to help you level up the quality of your music. And to help you even more on your musical journey, I have a special gift for you today. If you take a look in the description, I have a free download to some impulse responses I've made of my orange 212 guitar cabinet. It sounds pretty awesome. I have a bunch of different mic configurations in there. So if you feel like your guitar impulse responses aren't really quite up to par, or you're looking for something a little bit different, definitely go and grab this free guitar impulse response pack that I have for you. Again, the link is in the description. So before we jump into the session today and I show you a bunch of mixing tricks, I think it's important to talk about more of the DI mixing fundamentals before. And I also want to talk about why it's important to consider pre-processing your DIs before you reamp them. This video is going to get a little bit technical, but I'm going to do my best to break it down for you. When we EQ something with a clean EQ, that is called a linear process. And basically, all that means is that the order that we EQ something in our plugin chain doesn't really matter. So if we add 5 decibels of 100 hertz and then later on we take 5 decibels away, we're going to get the exact same sound that we had before we did any of that processing. So that's what linear processing means. The order that we do the processing doesn't matter. Now, what a lot of people don't understand is that cabinet impulse responses, by the very nature of convolution, is also a linear process. So if you have an cabinet impulse response loaded, you can EQ before or after that, and it will also be exactly the same. Again, that's because just like a clean EQ without any weird saturation effects in it, it is a linear process. And just like any good scientist or mixing engineer, we should be doing experiments to test what we think is going on. And so I'm going to pull you into a session, and I'm going to prove to you that both the EQ and the cabinet impulse responses are linear processes by doing what's called a null test. And a null test is very straightforward. It's very simple. Basically, it's a way to test to see if 2 audio sources are exactly the same. And we can test it by inverting the polarity of one of the sources so that basically the waveform that goes up will perfectly cancel the waveform that goes down. And we're left with complete silence if the audio file is exactly the same. If there are any differences at all, the absolute tiniest little bit of difference, we're going to hear that, and we'll know that those files are not the same. And these null tests are super easy to do. Anyone can do it, and I'm going to show you how to do that right now. The session that I have today is actually a series of multi-tracks that I downloaded from Brian Hood. So he gives these out for free. So if you're interested in getting some of these multi-tracks to mix yourself, I have a link to that in the description. And definitely go and check out some of the stuff by Brian Hood. He's an amazing dude. All right, so let's talk about how to perform a null test. It's very, very simple. If you have 2 tracks that you think are exactly the same, so let's duplicate this track. Okay, so here's a copy of the exact same track. If we want to make sure that these 2 files are exactly the same, all we have to do is invert the polarity of one of these tracks and then play them both back at the exact same time right now. Okay, so we can hear the guitar, so clearly they're not canceled out. All right, so let's go and invert the phase of this one. So we can just invert the polarity here. And when I hit play now, we don't hear anything, right? So these are exactly the same. And of course they are because we duplicated them. So now what I want to show you is that if we EQ before or after we have our impulse response loaded, it's going to be exactly the same. So I have the EQ going before this impulse response loader, and I have some Bogren Digital impulse responses. And then on this track, I have the exact same impulse response. Everything is the same, except we have the EQ after it. So if we invert the polarity of one of these tracks and play it back, if it's exactly the same, we won't hear anything, okay? So let me start by, again, having them both be the same polarity to make sure that they're not canceled. Okay, we hear it. Now let's invert the polarity. Can you hear anything? Nope, you can't, because it's exactly the same. So if you EQ before your cabinet impulse response or after, you'll get exactly the same effect. Okay, so wherever you want to put your EQ or other linear process, it's not going to change it one bit. Now, let's check out what happens if we EQ before and after a distortion plugin. Okay, so I have two guitar tracks. Again, these are identical guitar DIs, and I have now an EQ before our distortion and an EQ after a distortion. Okay? These are exactly the same. I'm going to hit play just to verify that they're not canceled out, and then we're going to invert the polarity again and see if they totally go silent. Here we go. Okay, so they're... Now notice, you heard a lot of weird little buzzy sounds when I inverted the polarity. It did not go silent, right? That is because the distortion is nonlinear. So what we do before and after the plugin are totally different. So this is so important to know. So maybe you're not getting the right sound when you're EQing after you've reamped the guitars, either with a real amp or an amp sim. Maybe you should try EQing before you reamp your guitars or your bass DI. And so that's what we're going to explore next. We're going to see what the differences are tonally when we process things before we reamp and after, so you can make a better decision when you're trying to sculpt your guitar or bass tone. Okay, so now I do not have the same guitar tone duplicated. I actually have two different DIs. This is like a left side and a right side guitar. And I'm starting by reamping these using STL Tonality. So it's a pretty awesome plugin. If you haven't heard of it, you should definitely check it out. I love the Will Putney plugin. Sounds awesome. So let's start by putting an EQ before we reamp the guitars with this amp simulator. And let's see what that does to the sound. So I'm just going to hit play, and then I'll start adjusting the EQ here. Now, something I want to point out. I'm adding almost 16 decibels of gain using this EQ plugin, and it doesn't sound really harsh, right? The guitars don't sound like they're screeching. There's not a lot of sizzle or hiss. Why is that? It's because the EQ is before the distortion. 16 decibels of gain at 12K does not equal 16 decibels of gain coming out of the distortion plugin because, again, it's a nonlinear process. Let's move this EQ after this distortion plugin and see what it sounds like now. Way different, right? So there are very, very big differences in how we can sculpt the tone if we have our EQ before our reamping or after. So when would you EQ before the amp sim or your real guitar amp? I would say that's best suited when you want to bring a little bit more sparkle or some subtle non-harsh presence out of your guitar. Also, there's very certain tones or characteristics that I hear amp sims have if you have a buildup of certain frequencies somewhere between like 800 and 1500 hertz, especially for distorted bass guitars. Let me show you what that sounds like. So here's a distorted bass guitar that I have. If we have a buildup of those frequencies I mentioned, listen to the sound of the distortion. So like right here, it almost sounds like the bass is like screaming, right? A little bit underneath the distortion. For me personally, I hate that sound. So if you come in and you pull out a lot of those frequencies before your distortion, your bass reamp, then it'll minimize that type of screeching. Same thing if we want to add a little bit of clank or remove that clank, I find that it sounds most musical before our reamp. Like right here, right? Want to clean it up, pull it out. And the same type of processing works great on distorted guitars. I find that EQing after an amp sim is a lot better for tonal adjustments or making the guitars fit within the context of the song. So if we're having a hard time with the vocals clashing with some of the electric guitars, try EQing after your amp sim or your reamp so that you can really make big adjustments to the overall tone to help everything gel together. So a really cool feature of FabFilter Pro Q3 is that we can instantiate a dynamic EQ band anywhere we want. So you can turn this outer ring and actually boost up frequencies here. And this will now act as a dynamic EQ. So when a sound reaches a certain threshold, it's going to actually increase the EQ by this amount. And then when it's below that threshold, it goes away. So this is really helpful because we can actually enhance some of the transients of our DI track. So let's try using the dynamic EQ to see if we can bring out a little bit more aggression of our DI tracks before we reamp and after. Having the dynamic EQ before we have the amp sim is really nice because it seems like we took a blanket off the guitar tone, right? It's now a lot more present, but it's not necessarily harsh yet. And the nice thing about the dynamic EQ is it emphasizes the transients a little bit more. So we're getting a little bit more aggression, we're getting a little bit more pick attack. Let's try it afterwards. So you can hear already we're getting like a lot of buildup in the harshness of the guitar tone. So this might not be the best strategy all the time. And again, I'm increasing the gain a ton just for demonstration purposes. More realistically, you're probably going to be closer to anywhere from like 3 to 5 dB here. Something else we can do is pull the dynamic band in the opposite direction. And this is really helpful for targeting maybe some woofy sounding frequencies, maybe from a guitar cabinet resonance. So let's go and just see if we can clean up the low end there. So this does a really good job after our amp sim. Let's try it before. And you can hear it has not even close to the same effect, right? That guitar cabinet resonance is still coming through, even though we're doing a lot to try to clamp down on it before it gets to our amp simulator. If you're looking to clean up guitar cabinet resonance, might be best to do it after you reamp. Okay, I want to show you an unconventional EQ that had been recently released by Eventide. It's called SplitEQ. This thing's pretty awesome. It allows you to EQ the transient information separately from tonal information. So if you think about that in the context of a guitar or bass DI, we can EQ the pick attack of the guitar or bass without affecting the tone of it, which is really, really awesome. So let's grab the transient band and see if we can highlight the pick attack. That's one of the reasons why I really love this plugin is because we can really boost the transient and make the pick attack really obvious and aggressive without making the guitars harsh. It's similar to using an EQ before we reamp the guitars. But I find this is even more transparent than that. Let's try this after the amp sim. So it sounds pretty good here as well. And I think it's because this has that technology that helps differentiate the tonal and transient information. So the last thing I want to talk about today is using a transient enhancer before and after our amp sim. So here's one by Waves. This is just Trans-X Multi. So it's a multi-band transient enhancer. So if we're looking to just enhance maybe the top sharp attack of the guitar, we can boost it, maybe around 3,800 hertz or whatever. Or if you want more body or woof coming out of the chugs, we can then come in here and maybe enhance this mid-range region. So let's see what this sounds like before the amp sim. So I'm really having a hard time hearing it. So I'm just going to crank this up. So we're really emphasizing those transients. So you hear it has this really nice movement it's adding. It makes it feel a lot more alive sounding than it did before. And at the same time, the cabinet resonance isn't becoming too boomy either, which is really, really nice. So having a transient enhancer before might be really beneficial. Let's move this after and see what it does. So you hear it's much more noticeable, right? The volume level is so much louder. So for something like this, obviously we would want to bring all these down. To my ears, it sounds a lot more synthetic. It doesn't feel like the guitar player was playing it. And this could be really, really cool for maybe a really slow, heavy breakdown at in a song, but for something that would go on a guitar track for the whole length of the song, this I think would be more of a distraction having this after our reamp than before. So out of all these mixing tricks that I showed today, which one are you the most excited to start implementing in your songs? Let me know in the comments below. I love hearing about your enthusiasm and seeing what other people are doing, and I know other people are going to benefit from it. So to summarize everything we talked about today, the order is very, very important when it comes to mixing DIs when we're going to be reamping them. And the reason that's the case is because distortion is a non-linear process. So any processing that we do before we reamp the guitars or bass is going to be very, very different tonally than if we do that processing or compression or EQ or whatever after the amp simulator. I find that pre-processing DIs with EQs, whether that's a static EQ, a dynamic EQ, or a specialty EQ like SplitEQ that allows you to separately EQ the transients or the tonal information, is really, really beneficial before we reamp the guitars. If we're trying to subtly emphasize and give a little bit more dynamics to the DI, we can also do things like putting transient enhancers before the amp sim as well. However, if we're trying to do a lot of corrective EQ or get all the different pieces of the mix to fit together, it's much more effective to EQ after we reamp the guitars, whether that's a real amp or an amp sim. If you're looking for more articulation in your guitar notes, then it's a good idea to also put a transient enhancer after the amp sim. You'll literally be able to hear the increase in volume from the initial attack when you have the transient enhancer after. So give that a shot next time you're working on a song. Try to put some of these processes before you reamp your guitars or after your amp sim or whatever. And don't be afraid to get a little creative. Try putting a limiter on your DI before you reamp it, or possibly even a clipper. Don't ever be afraid to experiment and try new things, even if it goes against what a lot of people are saying. And before you leave today, don't forget to go and download my free guitar cabinet impulse response pack that I have for you. There's a link in the description. I think you're going to find that super valuable. So thank you so much for your time and attention today, and I hope to see you in another video.